Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is 4 p.m. in London. And as we are all here in a global community at King's College China Week, and we're meeting online, but I'm sure there are very different time zones where you are. And our speaker today, our guest of honor, our author, Professor Dr. Ariane Ollier-Malaterre, is in Canada. So we are indeed joining in London across time zones. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today during the excellent King's College China Week. A few words about Ariane first. She is the Canada Research Chair in Digital Regulation at Work and Life and the Director of the International Network on Technology, Work and Family at the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada. The way Ariane describes her research, she says, my research focuses on individuals' work and life identities in light of technological changes and of diverse organizational and national contexts. And Ariane is also very interested in how technological and societal developments, including social media, algorithms, and AI, which also appears in the book, may change the nature of work and of interpersonal relationships at work and in life. This is what Ariane says about herself, but what do her past students say about her? We have one of them in the room here as well, and I have a note from him, an outstanding professor who gave her students a valuable understanding of the deep nuances in cross-cultural settings and of how management must be aware of the cultural patterns at work and in everyday life. That is a high praise that all of us could aspire to as teachers, I'm sure. Now to the book. The book speaks about this great tension between the discursive framing of surveillance and as it is seen as indispensable in China, on one hand, and the mental and emotional weight that participants bear as they cope with surveillance on the other. How do you research this? And Professor Malaterre has chosen interviews, and I'm sure this is, and has gone in depth indeed in her research, and this is a valid approach here. Now, Ariane, you begin with an acknowledgement. People are being surveyed everywhere. And that is true because I set my hair right before an ATM, because I know my picture is taken. Teenagers skateboard in a graffiti-covered underpass on a rainy October afternoon, and there's a red eye in the corner that witnesses their falls and their cries and their triumphs. As I jog towards a sketchy character on the Salo Bridge on a Sunday, I always look up to the cameras and think, at least there will be a video if something happens to me. Why is China so different then? What sets China's push to normalize public surveillance apart from the examples that we experience? And I want to quote you here. I'm sure you will touch upon it during the presentation as well. But you say in the book, several factors make China a fascinating setting in which to study surveillance. China has the highest ratio of closed circuit television, CCTV, to citizens, cameras to citizens in the world. You have one CCTV camera for every 12 people. I think your book provides incredible insights here on the state approach level, on the execution level, and most importantly, on the individual level. There are these fascinating stories that people tell you as they were honest with you. And for example, it still hasn't happened to me, so it doesn't really matter. This putting apart of self and surveillance as a good thing, as individuals are, at the end of the day, flawed and need a paternalistic system of sorts. You provide, and you were able to tease out fascinating psychological, personal, private insights. And you analyze the surveillance imaginaries, a term which was coined, as you say, by surveillance studies pioneer David Lyon. That is the mental image of surveillance and how people respond to it. It was fascinating to read. And I would also like to praise the fact that you kick off the book with a measured and researched account on social credit system as such. So your book is about China, your book is about surveillance in China, but you start from a wider perspective of an international perspective. And also you talk about this first idea that many people who perhaps are not specialists in this area as you are associate with China, the social credit system. And you dismantle quite a few myths there. And that's possibly the best account I've read. And if not for the later research, then at least for this, I recommend the book. I think it's a valid part of the book that can also be read and published on its own. So I also enjoyed the fact that you analyze not only the way people talk, but also how they react. So you take nonverbal reactions and emotions into account, and that provides depth. You did 58 research interviews in Chengdu, Shanghai, and Beijing, and you kept a diary of observations during the time you spent. And that is also, you will have to tell us how to be so organized in your research. I have a few questions for you, but let's maybe keep them until the end of the presentation. And dear colleagues, we have set aside around 20 minutes for Q&A, so please note down your questions. Dear Ariane, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Berzina Cerenkova. I really appreciate your introduction of the book, and thank you so much also, Osman. I don't know if you want to remain anonymous or not, but thank you so much for the praise. Let me share my presentation here and make sure that we go full screen. Actually, I may need to do this. Can you see it full screen now? Okay, wonderful. Let me just make sure I'm on the right page. So thank you so much to the King's College Lau Institute. I am very, very honored to contribute to the China Week. Thank you so much for everyone who is attending as well. I hope you will be able to learn as much as you want from this presentation. So today I'm presenting my book, Living with Digital Surveillance in China, which is exploring how citizens make sense of digital surveillance and live with it. It was published last October in the Routledge Studies in Surveillance series, edited by my surveillance scholars, eminent scholars that you see here. First of all, Kirsty Ball. And I want to express my gratitude to the Chinese colleagues, interpreters and participants who allowed me to travel to China and conduct this research. Also generous endorsers and book reviewers. I'm already fortunate to have 3 book reviews published on this book. Let me see if I can still, well, okay. So for this audience, I'm going to be quick on this because you're very likely aware that in China, although people all around the world leave digital footprints, so this is not unique to China, but in China, people really leave a wealth of digital traces every day. And that's in part due to the super apps, such as WeChat, Weixin, because people use them to not only talk with their friends and families, like we do, for instance, WhatsApp, but also to check the news on social media, to work. It's actually more used than email in many workplaces. And you can call the taxi, pay the bus, book a show. You can even give money to a beggar because they have QR codes. You can pay your utility bills, your taxes. So in short, cash has become really rare in China, and it's reserved for mostly very old people and foreigners. Although now there's a way to also pay with Alipay if you're a foreigner. On top of that, there are facial recognition cameras in many public and semi-public spaces. And real name registration that is tied to your ID and your phone number, that's mandatory for many uses of the internet. And the famous social credit systems, so I insist on the plural because the social credit systems are actually multiple and quite fragmented. And you have different systems in municipalities and commercial platforms. The most well-known is Sesame Credit. But it's by no means the unitary and all data-driven, algorithmic, big brother thing that some Western media have depicted. It's much more complex and still artisanal than this. My research questions pertain to Chinese citizens' surveillance imaginaries. So at the intersection of surveillance, privacy, internet studies, and Chinese studies. And I've been asking, to what extent do Chinese citizens notice the digital surveillance in their daily lives? What do they know about its different facets, especially when it's not clear? For instance, the social credit systems, it's quite opaque still. Do they change their behaviors in anticipation of surveillance? What do they think of it? How do they make sense of it? How does the multiple layers of context in China shape their discourse? And how do they feel regarding exposure to surveillance? So I call this a very humbling endeavor. It's perhaps one of the most difficult research I've led to this day. In part because my background is in sociology, management, psychology. I'm not a sinologist, so that's my first caveat. But I do have 20 years of experience in interviewing in different countries. I planned 2 years ahead. I had a sabbatical leave, so I planned to go interview people in China. It took quite a while, but I secured invitations in 3 universities and a research visa. And I took Mandarin courses at my university, obviously not enough. I wanted to take an emic perspective, so try and understand China from within China. Of course, you know, I do have Eurocentric biases and I can't eliminate them completely, but I really worked hard to try and reduce these biases in several ways. I began with a backpack solo trip on one of the Silk roads from Beijing to Kashgar. So that's an unorthodox research methods, perhaps, but I wanted to immerse myself kind of in an ethnographic way before I began the interview. And I took an inductive approach, meaning that I chose not to read the contemporary China studies literature before going to the field. I read it after I had conducted the interviews and had initial drafts of the different themes and patterns in the interview. And I also, if you read the book, you will see there's lots of interview excerpts because I wanted to give these people a voice. My analytical lens is polycontextual, meaning that I have examined multiple layers of historical, cultural, social, political, and economic context to understand surveillance in its systemic context. Conducting qualitative fieldwork in China as a foreigner, of course, has its challenges. So as Una said, I conducted I kept a research diary as I was traveling, and I did 58 research interviews in these 3 different cities. There were all Chinese citizens except 3 foreigners who were married or had long-standing residence in China, and there were mostly face-to-face. Of course, being a Uyghur and a Laowai, it's a bit complicated. Well, it has its advantages and its drawbacks, and I have a whole chapter on that in the book. So I conducted about half of the interviews with a Chinese interpreter, a doctoral student whom I had trained beforehand, and about half of the interviews in English without an interpreter, because the participants actually insisted that they wanted to do the interview in English. They were very proud of that. The challenges I met was, really try hard to listen to the participants in a non-judgmental, non-interfering way. Try to put my own baggage and views at a distance. Navigate the sensitive topics, self-censorship, the political speak that you inevitably get, and how to buffer your participants, interpreters, and colleagues against political risk. So I have the appendix methods in the book that addresses this, as well as the whole chapter on self-censorship. We can discuss it in the Q&A if you wish. Given my small sample, of course, the book does not claim to capture the experience of the whole of China. I do have a more educated and urban population than China's overall population. Although I really strived to balance it, I insisted with my Chinese colleagues to have migrant workers in the sample, to have taxi drivers, secretaries. I fetched a campus security guard, a dormitory aunt. So I also have these voices in the sample. So what are my key findings? And I'm trying to summarize this in 2 slides here before I go into more depths. So the first main finding was that the research participants made sense of surveillance through a cohesive system of narratives that cast surveillance as an indispensable solution to China's problems. There have been, lots of cross-cultural quantitative research that already highlighted that Chinese citizens tend to support surveillance more than, for instance, German or American citizens. But the book provides an explanation for this, the reasons why they say they support surveillance more than in other countries. And the reasons why are this system of anguishing narratives on the one hand and redeeming narratives on the other hand. So the anguishing narratives create a problem, they create fear, they create anguish, they create shame. And then you have the redeeming narratives that offer a convenient solution to appease these fears and this anguish. So what are these narratives? The ones that produce shame and fear are narratives of moral shortcomings. The first one will be very well known to sinologists in this virtual room. It's the lack of moral quality. I was, as a foreigner, I was quite intrigued and at first surprised by the fact that many participants actually lamented their fellow citizens' lack of following the rules, lack of moral character. They said that because people did not follow the rules, it made it necessary to treat them as children. So it was necessary to monitor the rules and to punish them to ensure moral progress in China. It's the typical discourses of the low-end population and a high-end population in terms of binaries like hao bu hao. The second one was the century of humiliations by foreign powers, also combined with continued fears to be undermined by Western powers or attacked by Muslim populations. So this is also very classic in China studies. It's what sinologists call a culture of insecurity or a civilization complex. And this, of course, set the stage for the imperative to revive the ancient Chinese civilization and gain international recognition, China's rightful place in the world. And the third anguishing narrative, which I will detail a bit more in this presentation, is a negative view of privacy, viewed as a suspicious desire to hide shameful information. So you can see that if you picture your country as lacking moral quality, as needing to overcome the national humiliations, and if you see privacy as being suspicious, you will want surveillance as uprooting moral secrecy and remedying these moral shortcomings. So very conveniently, the redeeming narratives were narratives of digital protection, with the government as protection and order, almost a parental figure, and the technology as a magic bullet that can force people to adhere to rules and modernize the country and uproot secrecy. So they viewed surveillance as care, as necessary in a country that they said was otherwise chaotic and ungovernable. However, there's another side of the medal, which is the cognitive and emotional costs of exposure to surveillance. In the interviews, I was very stricken by the great tension between the discursive framing of surveillance as indispensable in China, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the mental and emotional weight that participants bear as they cope with it. They expressed dislike, resentment, worries, frustration, fear, anger. They particularly feared being singled out by surveillance. So they had misgivings, objections, they had mental tactics to dissociate themselves from surveillance. And these misgivings arose when they pondered how they felt about surveillance more than how they thought of surveillance. I think this dichotomy between the cognitions and the affect is really important. So they built self-protective rationales, and I will detail that in the minutes that come. So if I wanted to summarize this underlying paradox, it would be surveillance is good for China. However, I don't like it, and I'm trying to forget about it. The structure of the book follows these key findings that I have outlined. So the first part of the book gives you some literature review definitions on privacy and surveillance worldwide, because this is not unique to China. And the second part of traces the historical roots of surveillance in China, because of course this is an old age practice. The second part of the book details the anguishing narratives. The third part pertains to the redeeming narratives. And the last part analyzes the mental and emotional weight, including self-censorship. So let me now focus on 3 specific chapters. I'll try to be brief. The first one is about privacy, the view of privacy as saving face and hiding shameful information. I think that's crucial to understand why some people would view surveillance as beneficial. So privacy, there are 2 words in Mandarin. The first one designates a personal thing you do not wish to disclose in public, whatever this thing may be, shameful or not shameful. So this is pretty close to the Western definitions. But the other word pertains to hiding a shameful secret. And when I ask my participants, what does it mean for you, privacy? What do you view as private and so forth? They clearly viewed it as the hiding of shame in order to save face and maintain moral and social respectability. So they wanted to control the exposure of shameful information and feelings to the social groups that could judge them negatively. So I love this quote: you never shoplift with a friend, because you're with a friend, you'd be too ashamed if you were caught. But you might take a chance if you are alone, even if there is a camera, because you don't know who's watching the camera. It's maybe not a friend, it's maybe not your mom, so it doesn't matter. So what do you hide? The scope of privacy, again, relies on the bidimensional understanding of face in Chinese thought. The first one is the moral face. So people would say they would hide behaviors, emotions that can be judged negatively. For instance, when they purchase personal medicine, that's code for Viagra. When they purchase weapons, that is something that they would want to not do in a way that leaves electronic traces. And then there's the social face, which is the relative status towards other people. So for instance, financial information, if you're doing poorly or if you're doing very well, better than others, that is something that you're going to hide as well, to not embarrass others. So who do you hide from? Interestingly, and not unlike in some Western research on privacy, people tend to hide from social groups more than from the government, so more horizontally than vertically. When I ask, who would, make you lose face, they said parents and supervisors, definitely you only give them safe news, hackers, but they didn't say abstract entities such as corporations or the government. And a really good example of that is Weibo, because Weibo is like Twitter, a very large public social network. And people write all sort of stuff in there because they use pen names. So they think that people cannot identify them, but then they forget that actually in Weibo you have to provide your real name upon registration, which means that the government can trace whatever you write. But they would say things like, on Weibo it's different, you can be yourself, you can write your true feelings, nobody can identify you, you can change your name, it's an escape. So you see, with this very brief discussion of privacy imaginaries, how they can shape surveillance imaginaries in the Chinese context, where you see wanting privacy as suspicious, and when what's on your radar is the social groups you belong to more than the companies or the government. So they view surveillance with potentially positive outcomes, such as uprooting moral secrecy, and state surveillance might not be seen as much as a threat or intrusion than in other country context. So I want to go more in depth now on the mental tactics to dissociate oneself from surveillance. That was huge in our discussions with the participants. I had 9 out of 10 participants that mentioned at least one tactic. So I have 4 main tactics that I'm going to analyze now. The first one is brushing surveillance aside with minimizing or denying. People would say nobody's watching. The government does not want to spend money to pay people to watch the cameras all the time, so nobody's watching. And I heard that so much that at some point, I was kind of frustrated with that. So I recorded an announcement on a train on the social credit system where passengers were being warned that, they were being filmed and that misbehavior would lead to a decrease in their social credit system score. And when I played it to an interviewee, she said, maybe they're bluffing. So that's an example of minimizing, denying. Ignoring was another big one. If I don't like the loss of privacy and freedom, I choose to ignore it. I don't think of it. Or they would say, it does not remind me all the time. Sometimes I choose to ignore it. So regarding the social credit system, they would say 3 things. 1, it's science fiction. We don't have that system. It does not influence their future. We don't have this. 2, they would say it can't be done technically. And that was actually an IT architect who said that. I don't know whether WeChat Weibo will record everyone's data because it is enormous. And that, in fact, is a real challenge. And 3rd, it may exist, but it's only financial, which was a very common confusion because the social credit system, at least as it was outlined, is not just financial, it's also behavioral. Another tactic also to brush surveillance aside was normalizing. People would say, everyone in China does it. We give our information, our ID, we feel secure. And they would give examples such as in the metro, when they started to scan bags, people were irritated, but 1 year later, everyone is lining up to be scanned. Or they would say, yes, we know the government is watching us. We can't watch YouTube, travel abroad, but it's not only the Chinese government. Most governments use social media as a tool to spy. So another way of normalizing it. Or they would reframe surveillance as either being temporary, it's just for a limited time. I can't buy these books, but it's limited in time. Or they will say, I love this quote, we value freedom. The country makes the laws, the regulation, it's the bottom line of all peoples, meaning we can't avoid that. The other behaviors are my freedom. For instance, what I will have for lunch. Or they will compare with history, say it's freer now than it used to be. They will control with other people. My friends in the government, they're not free to go, but I am free. Or they will say that the West is actually not free because we have drugs, we have firearms, things like that. Another interesting mental tactic was to other surveillance targets, saying, for instance, I'm a small potato. I'm just, a normal person. People will not want to intentionally find me. My personal data are not attractive to them. to do something. It's always them, by the way, not specific at all. Or they would say, I'm a good person. The blacklist, that's just for criminals. Again, this very dichotomic way of othering the targets of surveillance. So they will say, as human beings, we know we avoid bad behaviors, therefore we don't think our score will be reduced. Or they will say, for the better ones, the ones who obey the rules, the credit system is not going to be a problem. The third tactic was to wear blinders. By focusing on the daily life, personal privacy does not affect many people's life, or assessing the consequences for oneself and family. So they would say they would not mind that they are being watched or that there is a social credit system, but they would want to know how it works so that they are able to assess the consequences. And a huge one, I almost titled the book So Far So Good, was the temporal blinder, meaning, for now, so far, it has not harmed me, so I think it's okay. When it's coming, we'll think about it, but when it's far away from us, it's still okay. And the last one was fatalism. If you can't do anything about it, then it doesn't matter. This quote at the bottom, we think it's not useful, it's useless to spend time discussing the social credit system since we can't change it. We are little potatoes, the government is always right, we need to obey. It's like in Orwell's book, Animal Farm. And please note, this person did not mention 1984, which is, a classic trope of China othering, but they mentioned Animal Farm. Very briefly, I want to go through the misgivings and objections that about half of the participants mentioned. About half of them showed an acute awareness of surveillance and restrictions. They were trying to ignore it, but at the same time, they were aware. So they say, yeah, sometimes on WeChat, some articles are deleted. Sometimes I know it's the truth, meaning they were right to do that. Maybe the truth, sometimes it's reasonable, sometimes not. So they were aware of the fact they can't go on YouTube, Facebook, the books you buy, and they will say things like, maybe in the first place it was for financial purposes, but then it's behaviors that they want to control. So a very articulate political thinking about these restrictions. There were some rare behaviors to limit surveillance exposures, such as putting stickers on QR codes or using fake names or fake the company's address to have deliveries, changing passwords, things like that, knowing that, you can't watch something illegal on Baidu because they will remove it. So taking precautions. About half of the participants, again, expressed very, very strong feelings. Look at that. The feeling of being monitored is not good. It feels like not being treated as a human, more like a lab mouse in an experiment. I don't like feeling monitors. It's like I have an eye over me, behind me. And this person who said, I hate control. People can't be controlled. And she was really, really upset. Mentions of fear. For instance, I bought a book in Taiwan, but at the airport, my mother asked me to throw it away. Why? Well, they went through the Great Cultural Revolution. They are afraid. Or they maybe will feel fear if the system is abused or if it is used incorrectly. Generally, they express more support for generalized surveillance, but a clear refusal to be singled out. So we also see that in the West, that surveillance might be okay for the others, but not for me. So they say if the requirement is for every guest, if it's for all the people, it does not hurt you. Or they will say, I understand the reason why we need surveillance, but I don't want to be monitored. There were some marginal but very elaborate objections to generalized surveillance. People would say it's inefficient, it would add stress to the job, for instance, in the workplace. Or they will say it's inhuman. It requires that I don't have any bad sides. It's not natural. We cannot express our negative emotions. They will say I would prefer that we use education more than punishment. They will say we value freedom. And also another rationale was that would be a breach in equality between citizens, which of course is important in a communist country. So who gave you the power to differentiate us in that way? In terms of conclusions, so I've attempted very humbly to begin de-Westernizing the privacy and the surveillance research, and to show that the normalization of the culture of surveillance in China is framed in very specific nationalist and culturally embedded meanings, with age-old surveillance practices, pejorative meanings assigned to privacy, the importance of the national memory, which is very distinct, of course, from the national history, and a techno-nationalist view of technology as a civilizing force, nothing less than that. So technology can re-engineer society towards greater morality and prove the worth of the Chinese civilization. I hope the book contributes to surveillance and Chinese studies by showing this paradox and intra-individual tensions in China, that participants frame surveillance as indispensable, but at the same time, they fear exposure. They try to convince themselves they are not personally exposed. And this extends the framing of surveillance as care or coercion, which is a huge debate in surveillance studies, because the cognitions reflect surveillance as care, but the emotions and the subconscious defense mechanisms might reflect surveillance as coercion. Finally, I hope the book invites readers to a critical examination of other contexts than China, because surveillance is obviously also unfolding in Western liberal democracies and countries of the strike that, I should say, majority world now. And I think it would be very worthwhile to investigate surveillance and privacy narratives in these other contexts and see how they could be moral as well, with what context. And the book is accessible to the lay public and, of course, to students at every level, because it synthesizes the work of sinologists and it offers many interview excerpts. With that, thank you very much for listening to this talk. I hope we can now discuss it more. And I have, other slides, maybe if you have methods or questions on self-censorship and how I dealt with that.
Excellent. Thank you, Ariane. And indeed, my question, of course, given our bias towards academic topics and the fact that many today in the room are also past and present students, postgrads, academics. My methodological question, however, is a very personal one. You spoke about your reckoning of having to shield your respondents from possible reactions that they're very honest, I might add, responses could have cost for their lives. So my question is a very simple one. It's just 4 words, but it's also one that is very hard to answer. How to establish trust?
Thank you so much. I tried to be very, very upfront in the beginning of the interviews. So I greeted people in Mandarin. My accent is terrible, but I can manage a couple of sentences. And I think that goes a long way, as it does in every country. I also, whenever I could, I brought up my travels in China, because I think when you can express appreciation for a country's civilization and richness, that also goes a long way. So I introduced myself as being a French scholar working for a Canadian university. I have dual citizenship, but I'm mostly French. I mean, I spent 40 years in France before emigrating. For many interviews, I also had an interpreter who was a doctoral student who was able to say, this really is university research, so you can go ahead and be as honest as you want. I asked for permission to record the interview, saying it was, of course, anonymized. And then I took precautions also because my ethical board here in Montreal asked me to not keep a list of the participants. So I never had a list of their names and contact details. All was organized through the students. And I asked the students and colleagues to delete the lists as well. And when I had recordings, I then, I would upload on a OneDrive folder that my husband here would download in Canada, and then I would destroy everything, the transcripts, the notes, the recordings, so that they didn't remain on my computer or devices. I hope this answers in part your question.
Absolutely, thank you. And I will not be spending any more valuable time on myself. So we have already quite a few questions. And dear Ariane, if I may ask you to open the Q&A section in our Zoom, this way you can immediately answer the questions that you want to answer, and the ones that you find will give us the best outline and a good showcasing for the book. We have said.
Sorry, I had opened the chat. Sorry about that.
Yes, we have the Q&A.
I was wondering. Okay.
So,
have you explored the rationale of surveillance from the point of view of the authorities? If there are more surveillance in and around places, do surveillance work to replace the staffing of police? Yes, I did explore that, but only in the literature review, because my focus was really more to understand not the state's perspective, because there's excellent books already on that, how the surveillance infrastructure work at different levels. And yes, very briefly, yes, there is more surveillance around mosques and places where communities gather, especially in Xinjiang, for instance. But that was not the focus of the book. I wanted to really understand how people in their everyday life experience it and think of it and live with it. How do you cope when you have such surveillance exposure?
we'll read out the second question. The Chinese people would care about being exposed to the social group rather than the government, unlike the Western research. I would like to ask the reasons or your thoughts for this tendency. So the why question.
Yeah, I may have been unclear. It's actually like the Western research, because also in the Western samples, scholars observe that the social groups, the horizontal surveillance is more on people's radar than the vertical surveillance, corporations or governments. So it's a similarity between a Western context and the Chinese context, but it's much stronger in the Chinese context, to the extent that they will almost forget about the government surveillance, while, in Western countries, many people are suspicious of it or very aware of it. So why is that? It's because it's the social groups they belong to, so the parents, the families, the aunties, the supervisors, that can actually embarrass them and make them lose face. It's more tangible, it's more concrete in their daily realities. It goes very far. I know there are many students in this virtual room, so I'll give you one example. On WeChat, you have WeChat Run, where you can be ranked if you are the one in your community or in your group that has run the most in the past week. Say they would use that, but they would hide it from their supervisor, PhD supervisor, because they didn't want the supervisor to know that they spent so much time running. So they were very, very, articulate about maintaining their privacy towards specific targets, like parents and supervisors in particular.
Thank you. A quick technical follow-up for Merlin. Do the cameras store information for a fixed time, and do they get viewed only when needed? What do you know the input side?
No, again, I have not focused on the infrastructure of surveillance. There are scholars that try to do that. It's very opaque. And I think the reason for this opacity is that the cameras work best if you think that someone is watching all the time, like, the classic panopticon, Bentham's panopticon, where the prisoners do not know if someone is actually watching them from the central tower. So the cameras work best if people think that information is stored for a long time and then that they're being watched. But I don't have the answer to that. I really was not the focus of what I did.
So as long as it's in your head, the task is being fulfilled. Now we have a question from Adrian here. In a different study, I've read that there is a key difference in that Chinese people value security over privacy, whereas in the US it's the reverse, and that they see loss of privacy as an acceptable trade-off for the benefit of living in one of the safest parts of the world. What is your commentary on?
Yes, absolutely. That was a major theme in the discursive framing. So, at the cognitive level, not the emotional level, but at the cognitive level, many participants would say that cameras are good, that they appreciate it, that they appreciate the surveillance. They would give many examples, like, if a child is kidnapped, you will retrieve the child a lot easier and faster. If a grandfather who has dementia gets lost, you will also get help a lot faster. And conversely, they will say, I feel a lot safer in China than in the US, for example, because in the US, you don't have enough cameras. And if something happens, if I get robbed, if I get shot, So yes, definitely they value security a lot. And they mentioned the trade-off between security and privacy, and also between convenience and privacy. They said things like, of course, I could pay in cash, but I don't want to bother with a very heavy wallet with coins and stuff. I just need my phone, and I prefer to have my phone to pay, even though I know this leaves electronic traces.
Thank you. We have a group of questions which touch upon a similar concern. So I will not read out all of them, but just the one that I think sums it up. So how did you ensure that your interviews, which also involved an interpreter, were not themselves surveyed? How did you reassure your respondents over this? And do you think that the responses could have been partly self-centered? I think you approached that in the book, I remember, but maybe just for our listeners, we're and a very important point here, were officials aware of what your research topic was?
I have no way of reassuring participants that the interviews were not surveilled. I mean, that would be naive. In that context, I got a research visa, which included a research proposal. And the research proposal said that, I was going to inquire about digital technologies in China, including, for instance, social media, electronic payments, cameras, things like that. So yes, officials were aware. And also I got official invitations to give talks at Chinese universities. So, I mean, this was completely official. And as you may know, in many universities, the Communist Party is present. In some occasions, they were, located really close to the room where I would do the interviews. Other interviews were done in more public spaces like coffee shops, or for some of the interviews, I was able to get invited to their home. And of course, that was a lot better because they felt, I think, more reassured. In some instance, we put all the phones in the fridge so that we could continue the interview. That was the participants' request. So yes, the responses were themselves partly self-censored. Absolutely. I had maybe if you allow me, Una, I want to show just one more slide. Let me see if I can show this again to show you how it was censored. Here, for instance, I would have people saying they would claim that they lacked education and knowledge and couldn't respond to my questions. They would say, I am low educated. We don't really understand political issues. Or they would avoid politics. I don't want to know about politics, has nothing to do with me. I have no interest. Or they would express embarrassment. They would say, how can I say? It's hard to discuss. Or they would, because some of them gave me really honest, candid answers, I think. And the interpreters thought as well, because we would always debrief with the interpreters, how did that go? What did you think? And so forth. So some of them would say too much, and then they would stop dead. They would say, oh, no, it's not to protect us. That's not the reason. And then they would be like, oh, wait, what did I say? And they would go silent. So in that case, I would revert to a much easier question to, let them breathe, let them recover, and before we touched another complicated topic. Or they would direct the discussion. They would, directly discuss self-censorship and political speak. One of them was actually a bit rude. He said, I won't answer this question. Next question. That was funny in a way. Another of them said, she was nervous, embarrassed, and she said, I'm a member of the party. And this opened the door for a follow-up question. What do you mean? Do you mean that being a member of the party, your answer is going to be different? What do you mean? And then we discussed it. One of them told me, I hope you don't think it's propaganda, because he was educating me on why China is chaotic and why we need a strong government and a one-party system. So a little bit more on this, if I may. And if I manage to go to that other slide, because it may answer, okay, no, this is not working. Let me see if I can change that slide. What did I do? Oh, okay, maybe not a good idea to change. Yeah, can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, good. So also you asked Una about trust, and I see this is a topic of interest for people. The choice of language is very important. For instance, I noticed that the participants used sensitive and not political. They would use metaphors for the government or the Communist Party. They would say the country, the family. So I would also use these terms. Then I would ask non-threatening questions. I would say if someone is put on the blacklist, not if you are put on the blacklist. I would watch the body language for signs of tensions, because the body language thing was huge. I had people keeping silent, opening their mouths, and nothing would go out, and I would wait, and then they would close the mouth and I would wait, and then they clench their jaws and they go like that, and then they lower their voice, and all of a sudden they would launch and give me some huge chunk of political speak, and then they would calm down. I would do an easier question. Sometimes I call that an emergency landing, if a participant is too embarrassed or upset. So you do very easy questions such as, what do you like in WeChat? And then you can go back. So that's how I try to manage that.
Thank you. It's a good thing you had that extra slide for us. We only have 7 minutes left, so please take control and look at the questions, the ones you want to answer most. Apologies, colleagues, you have a set of great questions and we won't be able to tackle each and every one, so let's give Ariane the hand of the choice.
Parties in the West of growing support of pushing for social credit mass surveillance. How do you think this will evolve? Will be adopted in the West? Well, a very obvious example of this is the counter-terrorism rationale. In France, for instance, the government changed the law to allow real-time facial recognition cameras as temporary for the Olympics. And yes, of course, we're very happy that there was no terrorist incident for the Olympics. But the next thing that is happening is that these cameras have been normalized and they're going to remain. So I think security, national security, counterterrorism is an obvious rationale to justify mass surveillance. Not social credit, though, because the EU AI Regulations Act explicitly said that the EU is not going to implement a social credit, in part because, they were, I think, misunderstanding what the Chinese social credit system is. But anyways, how was it navigating institutional navigation? Yeah, right. So I reached out to a colleague who was part of a network that, we had longstanding practice with, and that was for one. Then I reached out through a Chinese friend for another colleague, and the third one was out of the blue, actually, someone who gave a keynote. And I emailed and said, look, I want to, Chinese technologies are pioneering social media, facial recognitions. I want to learn more about that. I want to compare it to the West. Would you host me? So that's how I tried to do that. But when I gave my talks, I was advised that, of course, there was a representative from the Communist Party in the room. So I was told beforehand that you know, my talk would be monitored. When students express views on surveillance in other countries, did you personally think their views were accurately informed? Yes, actually, especially the students who had traveled abroad. Some of them had studied abroad, so they were quite knowledgeable about surveillance. To the extent that you can be knowledgeable, because many of these systems are quite opaque, in specifically the social credit system. You know, the experts on the social credit system are still trying to parse it out because it's so complex and evolving as well. How do you think the responses were compared to other citizens in other countries? I think they were on the one hand, many elements were quite similar to Western findings on privacy and privacy apathy and resignation. That's also things that you find in the West. But on the other hand, they were really specifically uniquely Chinese. In particular, the discourse on rules and punishment and lack of moral character, and how you needed to educate citizens because they were like children. The discourse on national humiliations by foreign powers. I think this must be very specific. I mean, you could find discourses on national humiliations, for instance, in colonized countries around the world. But the way it was framed was, I think, specifically Chinese. And that's why I think it would be amazing if we could do that sort of research on other country context to analyze the different layers of context and the content of the narratives that justify surveillance. Sorry for my long question. Have you explored some complexity surrounding the surveillance system in terms of its ineffectiveness? Yes. As a Chinese citizens, the police not able to solve cases. Yes, absolutely. You know, there's all this talk, public relations or propaganda talk of big data, algorithms, efficiency of surveillance. But when I went through several checkpoints, because one day I was in Xinjiang, I wanted to visit the Uyghur village, you know, the only one that foreigners could visit. And I went through 7 checkpoints, and I was asked each time to disembark the bus and show my passport. And I was asked to actually enter my information manually, because the poor officer that was there said, you know, look, I don't even understand it. I don't know what's your first name, what's your family name, where is your passport number? Can you please fill it for me? So you see, this is how difficult and sometimes ineffective it could be, because I could very well have entered wrong information. And then I had hotel staff banging at my door at midnight saying, your visa is expired, because they couldn't read the actual duration and dates of the visa. So I had to explain it to them and calm them down. So there's a huge discrepancy between what you think surveillance is in China and could be when the systems actually work. And there's been a lot of integration during the pandemic, and sometimes what it is on the ground. Yes, there's a lot of research on that. Maybe one last question. Did any students have reflections on how AI might change the ability for authorities to effectively? Yes, they said, you know, we're on the big train of AI. There's nothing we can do about that. And AI is going to make surveillance inescapable. So that led to a lot of resignation and powerlessness. Yes. I think I'll stop here.
Dear Ariane, thank you. That was quite a sprint through the questions, and it's my apologies to the colleagues whose questions went unanswered. I'm sure we can keep in touch, and Ariane can also answer them later on as you communicate. And thank you so much for today. We have some interesting thinking to do. And I especially thank you for not dwelling too much on the dichotomy of if something is true for China, then it surely must not be true for the West and vice versa. So you've avoided these simplified dichotomies. And thank you for your work. And please remind everyone, where can they purchase the book?
And if you buy the book on Amazon, please rate it, write a review. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The China Week at King's College London continues, but our conversation today is over.
Thank you so much.